The desert has a silence that deceives. At first glance, it feels empty, lifeless, as if history could never have passed through it. But when the wind begins to rise and the sand shifts across the endless plains, the desert starts whispering its memories. Memories of men who came here to fight, to win, and to die. It was in this unforgiving landscape, beneath the blinding sun of North Africa, that the rivalry between two of the most famous commanders of the Second World War took shape. Their names would become linked forever. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and Bernard Law Montgomery, the man sent to stop him. When Bernard Montgomery arrived in Egypt in August 1942, few outside the British Army knew much about him. Even inside the officer corps, he was respected more than admired, regarded as strict, methodical, and unyielding. Yet he was stepping into the greatest crisis the British Empire had faced since the war began. Rommel's Africa Corps had torn through Libya, shattered one British formation after another, and now stood deep inside Egypt, dangerously close to the Suez Canal. The defeats were so numerous that the word retreat had practically become part of the daily vocabulary of the troops. Montgomery walked into a theater of war on the verge of collapse. Soldiers were exhausted, morale was fragile, and confidence in leadership had been shaken. Rommel's name carried a weight that was almost mythic. To British soldiers, he seemed less like an adversary and more like a relentless force of nature, always arriving where he shouldn't, always striking at the moment of greatest vulnerability. Every map, every report, every whispered conversation at night seemed to confirm the same fear, that nothing could stop the Desert Fox. But when Montgomery first addressed his staff, and then the men of the Eighth Army, something shifted. He did not shout. He did not dramatize the situation. He spoke calmly, firmly, almost coldly. And he said the words that would define the beginning of his legend. "We will fight here. There will be no withdrawal." For soldiers who had been pushed back for months, these words were more than an order. They were a promise. A promise that the days of confusion were over. A promise that someone had finally taken hold of the wheel. Where other commanders might have rushed to action to prove themselves, Montgomery did the opposite. He reorganized the entire army from top to bottom. He demanded clarity, discipline, communication, and above all, preparation. He visited units constantly, not to inspire with emotion, but to make every soldier understand that this time, victory would not depend on desperate improvisation. It would depend on method. This was the essence of Montgomery's command philosophy, forged in the mud and blood of the First World War. As a young officer, he had nearly died in France when a German sniper's bullet ripped through his chest and exited near his spine. The trauma of that war, the chaos, the incompetence, the senseless waste of life, stayed with him forever. He had seen too many battles lost because officers acted without planning, because troops were thrown into attacks without proper support, because bravery was treated as a substitute for logistics. Montgomery despised such thinking. His entire approach to warfare rested on one belief: you win battles by preparation, not by miracles. But the man he had come to defeat was the master of the unexpected. Rommel thrived on boldness, deception, sudden strikes, rapid movement. He was everything Montgomery was not: improvisational, instinctive, daring to the point of recklessness. Their duel would soon become one of the most studied showdowns in military history. Yet in the late summer of 1942, before the great clash at El Alamein, Montgomery was still just a name, unknown to most British civilians, unfamiliar to many American officers, and seen as merely another general sent to try his luck against Rommel. No one suspected that the man in the black beret, with the stern expression and clipped voice, would soon turn the tide of the entire Desert War. What made Montgomery so effective in these early days was not charisma. He had little of that. It was not popularity. The soldiers respected him, but they did not warm to him. What set him apart was his absolute certainty. He radiated confidence not through charm, but through precision. Every directive, every adjustment, every inspection conveyed the same message. I know what needs to be done, and we will do it properly. There was something almost unsettling in the way he ignored the fear that had spread through the ranks. He refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat, not out of arrogance, but out of conviction that doubt itself was a weapon Rommel had already used against them. Soldiers later recalled that when Monty looked at you, you felt as if he already knew the outcome of the battle, as if it had been settled somewhere inside his mind long before the first shot was fired. And so, the Eighth Army waited. It waited as Montgomery strengthened defensive positions, reorganized supply routes, retrained units, and stabilized the front. It waited as minefields were reinforced, artillery schedules coordinated, tank crews drilled repeatedly in maneuver and gunnery. It waited as he studied Rommel, learning the rhythms of the man's thinking, anticipating where the desert fox might strike next. Montgomery believed that the battle to come would not be won by brilliance on the day of attack. It would be won by the hundreds of hours spent preparing for it. And in that belief, he stood alone among the Allies because he knew the cost of rushing. He had seen too many commanders chase glory at the price of thousands of lives. To some of his officers, this approach felt painfully slow. To others, it was the first time they had seen order in months. But even the skeptics admitted that something was changing. The army was regaining its shape, its confidence, its will. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the desert wind swept across the tents of the Eighth Army, some soldiers whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, they finally had a commander who could stand against Rommel not just in courage, but in intellect. They were right. The clash that would come, the great battle of El Alamein, would not only determine the fate of North Africa, it would define Montgomery's career, reshape the balance of power in the Mediterranean, and prove to the world that Britain still had fight left in it. But Montgomery's story is larger than a single victory. He would rise from the desert to command armies in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. He would clash not only with Rommel, but with Patton, Eisenhower, Bradley, and nearly every senior Allied commander. He would triumph brilliantly in some battles and miscalculate disastrously in others. He would become a national hero and a source of constant controversy. Yet here, in the burning heat of the North African desert, is where his journey into legend truly began. A journey defined by discipline, shaped by trauma, and driven by a belief that war must be fought not with chaos, but with control. Montgomery did not set out to be loved. He set out to win. And in 1942, when Britain needed someone to turn the tide, he was exactly the man they needed. In the story of Bernard Law Montgomery, the deserts of North Africa and the fields of Normandy often overshadow the quieter chapters that shaped him long before he became a military commander. But to understand the Montgomery who would one day face Rommel, clash with Patton, and challenge Eisenhower himself, one must begin in the world of his childhood, a world defined by strict discipline, emotional distance, and a deep sense of duty. Montgomery was born on November 17, 1887, into a family that seemed at first glance traditional and privileged. His father, Henry Montgomery, was a deeply religious Anglican bishop, a man of sermons, scripture, and unshakable belief. His mother, Maud Montgomery, was stern, demanding, and sparing with affection. Their household was one in which duty stood above comfort, obedience above warmth. This atmosphere would play a profound role in shaping the boy who would one day lead armies. A household without softness. Montgomery's early home was not a place of tenderness. His mother ruled the house with rigid control. To her, affection was a luxury and discipline a necessity. She believed in toughening her children, preparing them for a world that offered little mercy. The children were expected to obey without question, to follow strict routines, and to present themselves with dignity at all times. Those who knew Montgomery later in life noted something similar in his behavior, a certain emotional reserve, a coolness in his interactions, and a tendency to hide vulnerability. These characteristics did not emerge on the battlefield. They were forged in a childhood where feelings had no place and discipline was survival. His father, though kinder in temperament, was often absent. As a bishop, he spent long months abroad, traveling through distant parts of the British Empire. While his work was noble, it created a void in young Bernard's life, one filled not by a father's warmth, but by a mother's unyielding rigidity. In this environment, Bernard learned two lessons that would become central to his personality. Never show weakness. Control is the key to survival. Years later, soldiers would observe that Montgomery rarely doubted himself. He spoke with authority, demanded precision, and showed little patience for those who hesitated. But beneath this exterior was the memory of a child who grew up believing that confidence was not just a leadership quality, it was a shield against vulnerability. A restless boy in a strict world. Montgomery was not an easy child. He was energetic, rebellious, quick-tempered, and prone to mischief. At school, he caused trouble frequently. Teachers complained about his stubbornness. He challenged authority with a boldness unusual for the time. He did not enjoy sitting quietly or learning abstract lessons. He preferred action, movement, and competition. His mother responded to this behavior with increasing strictness. Punishments, isolation, cold lectures. Rather than breaking his spirit, these measures hardened it. Montgomery grew more independent, more determined, more ready to fight for his own place in the world. The quiet obedience of a Victorian child was not in him. It was in these early years that one can see the seeds of the man he would become, a commander who refused to back down, who argued fiercely with his equals, who insisted that his methods were the right ones, and who never shied from confrontation. He did not fear conflict. He grew up inside it. A move to Tasmania, a strange new world. In 1889, when Bernard was still a toddler, the Montgomery family moved to Tasmania, where his father had been appointed bishop of the island. The move took them far from England's familiar landscapes and placed them in a world of rugged wilderness, unfamiliar customs, and colonial life. This period, though short, had an influence on Montgomery's sense of identity. He learned to adapt to unfamiliar surroundings, to live far from the comforting centers of British civilization, and to see himself as part of an empire that stretched across the globe. The long voyages by ship, the isolation of colonial life, the impression of wide landscapes, these early images would echo later in the deserts of North Africa, where he would one day walk among the dunes with calm assurance. Yet life in Tasmania did nothing to soften him. His mother remained strict, and the expectations placed upon him were as cold and uncompromising as ever. Bernard learned to mask his emotions, to endure hardship without complaint, and to push through discomfort with determination. Return to England, and the beginning of discipline. When the family returned to England years later, Bernard entered St. Paul's School in London. Here, he encountered a different kind of challenge: academic rigor. Montgomery was not naturally inclined towards studies. He found the classroom environment restrictive, formal, and dull. But military drill, competitive sports, and physical activity appealed to him immediately. It was here that his natural leadership began to show. He was not popular, but he was respected. His peers noticed his confidence, his ability to make decisions quickly, and his unwillingness to be intimidated. He stood out not through charm, but through presence. Montgomery later claimed that the rigid structure of his home life prepared him for military discipline. Orders did not frighten him. Responsibility did not overwhelm him. In many ways, the military environment felt like a natural extension of his upbringing. Strict, hierarchical, demanding, but consistent. Sandhurst, the crucible of the soldier. Montgomery entered the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1907. It would prove to be the defining turning point of his early life. For the first time, he was surrounded by peers who were as ambitious and competitive as he was. The environment at Sandhurst was harsh, physically demanding, and psychologically taxing. Cadets were pushed to their limits. Long drills, tactical exercises, relentless inspections, and a culture where weakness was not tolerated. Montgomery thrived. He excelled in physical training, field exercises, and practical leadership. He was not the fastest runner or the best marksman, but he possessed something far more valuable: clarity under pressure. He remained calm when others panicked, decisive when others hesitated. Even as a cadet, he had an unmistakable aura, a sense that he expected others to follow him. His instructors noticed, his fellow cadets noticed, Montgomery himself noticed. Though not yet the Montgomery of legend, the foundation was laid. Commission into the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. In 1908, Montgomery received his commission as a second lieutenant in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. This was the beginning of a formal military career that would span nearly 5 decades. The peacetime army of the early 20th century was small, traditional, and slow-moving. Young officers spent much of their time on drills, social functions, and colonial duties. It was a world built on continuity rather than urgency. Montgomery did not fit easily into this environment. He frustrated older officers with his bluntness, his unwillingness to tolerate inefficiency, and his conviction that the British Army needed modernization. Yet even then, he displayed a talent for improving the units under his command. Training became sharper, discipline tighter, performance more reliable. He was the kind of officer who demanded much, but delivered results. But nothing in these early years prepared him for the event that would change his life forever: the First World War. The First World War, the wound that defined him. In 1914, when Europe descended into war, Montgomery's regiment was among the first sent to France. What happened next would become one of the most crucial psychological turning points in his life. During the early battles of the Western Front, chaotic, brutal, and poorly coordinated, Montgomery was shot by a German sniper. The bullet entered his chest, passed through his lung, shattered his ribs, and exited through his back. His men believed he would not survive. Some claimed that they had already prepared to report him dead. But Montgomery lived. Barely. He was unconscious for days, dangerously weak for weeks, and bedridden for months. His right lung was permanently damaged. His mobility was limited. His recovery took nearly a year. This injury did more than nearly kill him. It transformed him. It solidified his hatred of disorder. It hardened his belief in planning. It carved into him a conviction that lives were lost, not because soldiers lacked courage, but because commanders lacked foresight. Montgomery had seen how badly the British Army was prepared for modern warfare. He had witnessed how outdated tactics led to thousands of deaths. He had nearly become one of those casualties. From this moment onward, he vowed never to lead men into battle without overwhelming preparation. He vowed never to waste lives through impulsive decisions. He vowed that every operation under his command would be thought through to the smallest detail. These were not abstract beliefs. They were born in blood. A return to duty, a new Montgomery. After recovering from his wounds, Montgomery returned to the front in 1916. The man who came back was noticeably different from the officer who had left. He was sharper, more direct, more disciplined, and far more demanding. He rose through the ranks quickly, distinguishing himself in training, organization, and morale building. He became known for his ability to transform poorly performing units into reliable fighting forces. Officers described him as intense and uncompromising, sometimes difficult, but undeniably effective. The First World War shaped Montgomery's worldview profoundly. He emerged from it believing 3 principles that would guide the rest of his career. 1. Battles are won by preparation, not improvisation. 2. Leadership must be absolute. Confidence inspires confidence. 3. A commander's first duty is to preserve the lives of his men through discipline and planning. These principles would one day guide him through Alamein, Normandy, and beyond, leaving the war with the mind of a commander. By the time the war ended in 1918, Montgomery was no longer a young officer finding his place. He was a fully formed military thinker. His experiences had forged him into a man who believed deeply in method, organization, and clarity. His childhood had given him discipline. His injury had given him caution. The battlefield had given him purpose. The Montgomery who stepped into the interwar years was ready for the responsibilities that lay ahead, responsibilities that would eventually bring him into confrontation with Rommel, with his own allies, and with history itself. His early life had not been warm or gentle, but it had forged a man uniquely suited for the trials of the next war. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Bernard Montgomery stood among the survivors of a conflict that had redrawn the map of Europe and reshaped millions of lives. He had entered the First World War as a young, headstrong lieutenant and emerged from it hardened, wounded, and profoundly changed. The interwar years, often treated as a quiet gap between two cataclysms, were, for Montgomery, a time of transformation. They honed his intellect, sharpened his discipline, and set him on the path toward the leadership he would one day wield in North Africa and Western Europe. To understand the Montgomery of El Alamein and Normandy, one must understand the Montgomery of the 1920s and 1930s, the officer who trained relentlessly, studied obsessively, and demanded standards that many considered excessive. While other soldiers drifted through peacetime postings, Montgomery treated the interwar decades as preparation for a war he believed would inevitably come again. Recovering from the wound that almost killed him, Montgomery did not walk away from the First World War unscathed. The sniper's bullet that tore through his chest in 1914 left permanent physical damage. One lung remained partially impaired for the rest of his life. He carried deep scars and endured recurring bouts of pain. His recovery was slow and frustrating. For a man as active and restless as Montgomery, being confined to hospital beds and rehabilitation clinics was torture. But the long convalescence also offered something he had not experienced since childhood: time for reflection. He thought about the chaos he had witnessed on the Western Front, the thousands of lives lost to poor planning, the disorganized offensives, the rigid thinking of senior commanders who failed to grasp the brutal mechanics of modern warfare. Montgomery realized that if another war came, it could be fought better. It must be fought better. He believed the price of unpreparedness had been far too high. Years later, he would say, "The First War taught me that battles are won before they are fought." This conviction became the foundation of his entire military philosophy in the interwar years. A changed officer returns to the Army. When Montgomery finally rejoined his regiment, he did so with a seriousness that set him apart immediately. He had seen the worst consequences of poor leadership and was determined never to repeat the mistakes he had witnessed. Many officers who returned after 1918 came back weary, uncertain, or resigned to the slow pace of peacetime soldiering. Montgomery was none of these. He returned brimming with ideas, some practical, others radical, about how the British Army needed to change. He believed the war had exposed weaknesses: outdated doctrine, insufficient emphasis on training, lack of flexibility among senior officers, poorly coordinated infantry-artillery cooperation, over-reliance on tradition instead of analysis. Montgomery saw modernization as essential. He pushed for reforms constantly. His superiors, however, did not always appreciate the criticism. The British Army in the 1920s was steeped in tradition and suspicion of younger officers who appeared too opinionated. Montgomery did not care. He had seen what complacency looked like, and it looked like mass graves. The interwar officer, a perfectionist, emerges. The British Army of the 1920s shrank dramatically. Budgets were slashed, equipment aged, units were scattered across colonial possessions, where the military's role was more symbolic than strategic. Many officers adapted to a comfortable routine. Montgomery went the opposite direction. He dedicated himself to training. Whatever unit he was assigned to, whether in the UK, Ireland, India, or Palestine, quickly developed a reputation for discipline and efficiency. Soldiers in his battalions often complained about his demanding nature. but they also recognized that his methods made them sharper, faster, and more professional. Montgomery introduced rigorous physical conditioning, tactical rehearsals for even minor maneuvers, emphasis on initiative among junior officers, attention to detail in logistics and planning, modern map reading and navigation skills, clear, simple orders that soldiers could understand instantly. Where some officers preferred ceremonial drills, Montgomery preferred battlefield realism. He wanted his men to practice the way they would fight, not the way the army had fought in the past. He once remarked, "If you sweat more in training, you bleed less in battle." This was not a slogan, it was a personal creed. Ireland, a trial by fire in a troubled land. In the early 1920s, Montgomery was posted to Ireland during the Irish War of Independence and the turbulent years that followed. It was a difficult and politically sensitive assignment. Officers had to face ambushes, sabotage, and a civilian population deeply distrustful of British forces. Montgomery's experience in Ireland refined his understanding of morale and discipline. He learned that confusion within a unit could be fatal, and that clear leadership was essential in chaotic environments. His insistence on structure and routine helped prevent unnecessary casualties. But Ireland also exposed him to a different kind of conflict, one where the enemy did not always wear a uniform and where the battlefield was as much psychological as physical. This experience would later influence his emphasis on clarity, communication, and preparation. India and the Empire. Montgomery's education in command. Montgomery's service in India further expanded his understanding of command. India was not a combat posting during his time there, but it was a place where officers learned to command large numbers of men from different cultures, languages, and traditions. Managing such diversity required patience and communication, two skills that Montgomery continuously refined, even if his manner could sometimes seem severe. He became known for his ability to transform inexperienced units into cohesive, effective forces. He trained them ruthlessly, believing that only discipline could overcome the challenges of geography, climate, and distance. Even when stationed far from Europe, he kept his eyes fixed on the future, convinced that another major war would eventually engulf the world. A personal transformation. Finding stability in marriage. One of the most significant events of Montgomery's interwar life occurred not on a training field or in a military office, but in his personal life. In 1927, he married Betty Carver, a widow with a young son. For a man raised in emotional austerity, marriage opened a side of Montgomery that few had seen. Betty brought warmth into his life, balance into his routine, and support into his career. Montgomery was a devoted husband and stepfather, deeply attached to his family. Friends later said that Betty softened him, giving him a sense of stability and emotional grounding that his childhood had denied him. Their marriage, though tragically short, was transformative. Betty's influence helped Montgomery in ways that would become clear only after his greatest battles. She gave him perspective, humility, and the ability to see beyond the rigid walls of military structure. Her death in 1937 from sepsis devastated him. It was one of the greatest emotional blows of his life. Montgomery never remarried, and those who knew him said he was never the same after losing her. The loss intensified his work ethic, his perfectionism, and his emotional reserve. Perhaps subconsciously, he poured his grief into discipline. Betty's memory followed him into every campaign he later fought. Climbing the ranks. The making of a senior officer. Throughout the interwar years, Montgomery steadily rose through the ranks. His promotions were not the result of charm or political connection, qualities he lacked entirely, but the result of relentless dedication and undeniable competence. He became a staff officer, attended advanced military courses, and gained exposure to high-level planning. Unlike many officers who struggled with the theoretical aspects of command, Montgomery excelled in them. He understood the importance of logistics, communication, and timing, and he developed a reputation as one of the Army's brightest thinkers. During this time, he also refined his personal command principles. Clarity. Orders must be simple enough that even the lowest ranks understand their purpose. Control. A commander must always know what his units are doing and must ensure they are doing it correctly. Preparation. No attack should be launched until every detail has been rehearsed and every man knows his role. Morale. An army's spirit is as important as its equipment. These ideas were not abstract theories. They were rooted in his experiences in France, Ireland, India, and Palestine, and they would one day define his victories. The approach of another war. As the 1930s progressed, tensions in Europe escalated. The rise of Hitler, the rearmament of Germany, and the failure of appeasement made war increasingly inevitable. While many in Britain hoped that diplomacy would avert conflict, Montgomery privately believed that another war was coming, and that it would require new tactics, new thinking, and uncompromising discipline. He wrote extensively about tactical doctrine, training methods, and leadership principles. His reputation as a modernizer grew, though not always to the delight of more conservative senior officers. His confidence could be abrasive. His criticism could be sharp. But even his detractors admitted that Montgomery possessed an extraordinary gift. He understood how to turn ordinary soldiers into a powerful, unified force. By 1938, as Europe edged closer to catastrophe, Montgomery was one of the British Army's most experienced, prepared, and intellectually driven officers. He had not fought since 1918, but he had been preparing for decades. A commander forged in peace, prepared for war. The interwar years did not offer Montgomery glory or fame. They did not place him on the front pages of newspapers or in the spotlight of public admiration. But they shaped him more deeply than any battlefield could. These were the years in which his discipline became iron, his philosophy of war crystallized, his leadership style matured, his perfectionism became a defining trait. His personal tragedies deepened his resolve. His intellectual rigor set him apart from his peers. The Montgomery who entered the Second World War in 1939 was not merely a product of the battles he had fought. He was a product of the battles he had avoided, the flaws he had studied, and the lessons he had absorbed in the long quiet between two global storms. Soon, the world would see the results of those years. Soon, he would face Rommel. Soon, he would step onto the world stage. But before all of that, Bernard Montgomery had to survive the long peace. And in surviving it, he became the commander history needed, for better or worse. When Bernard Montgomery stepped off the aircraft at Cairo Airport on August 13, 1942, the air felt thick with heat and anxiety. The desert wind carried with it not only sand, but fear. Fear that the British Empire was on the verge of losing the entire North African campaign. Rommel's forces were less than 70 miles from Alexandria. The Suez Canal, the strategic artery of the empire, was within reach of the Axis. Egypt trembled. British officers whispered their doubts in quiet corners, and the soldiers of the Eighth Army, exhausted by months of retreat, had lost belief in victory. Into this boiling atmosphere walked a man in a black beret, walking quickly, his posture straight, and his expression hard. Montgomery's arrival was not dramatic in the public sense, but it was seismic in the psychological sense. In commanders' tents, in barracks, in outposts scattered across the desert, the same rumor passed from mouth to mouth. There's a new general. Not just any general, one rumored to be different, demanding, and relentless. A man who did not tolerate disorder. A man who spoke his mind. A man who claimed that the age of defeat was over. The Eighth Army before Montgomery, a force on the edge. To understand the scale of the task Montgomery inherited, one must understand the condition of the army he was sent to command. The Eighth Army, once proud, once hopeful, had been battered for months. Campaign after campaign had gone wrong. Rommel had sprung surprise attacks. flanked British positions, shattered armored brigades, and inflicted humiliating defeats. The army's morale collapsed under several heavy blows. The retreat from Cyrenaica, the chaotic fallback to the Gazala line, the disaster of Tobruk Rommel's pursuit into Egypt. Officers were exhausted. Soldiers felt abandoned by London. Commanders changed so frequently that no consistent strategy remained. Supplies were short. Confidence was shorter. Montgomery later wrote, "I found an army tired of being ordered to retreat. It had lost its spirit." He would change that, not through charisma or charm, but through discipline, clarity, and uncompromising authority. Montgomery's first impression of the Desert War. Montgomery studied the map of the Western Desert the moment he arrived at headquarters. It was a battlefield unlike any he had commanded before, an endless plain of sand dunes, rocky ridges, and blinding heat, where the difference between life and death often came down to logistics, fuel, water, and ammunition. He understood something immediately. This war was not about elegance or maneuver. It was about attrition, endurance, and the will to hold ground. Rommel had mastered mobility. Montgomery would master control. He observed weaknesses in the British defense. Overextended lines, poor communication between infantry and armor, inconsistent command structures, hasty retreats and panic withdrawals, reliance on fragmented reactive tactics. Montgomery's conclusion was blunt. The time for improvisation is over. The first orders: clarity and no more retreats. Montgomery's first actions as commander were simple but revolutionary. He issued 2 orders. 1. There will be no more withdrawals. This was not rhetoric. It was a strategic directive. The Eighth Army would stand and fight at El Alamein, a natural defensive bottleneck between the Mediterranean Sea and the Qattara Depression. There was nowhere else to retreat, and Montgomery refused to let the idea even enter his officers' minds. 2. All plans for further retreat will be burned. British staff officers had quietly prepared contingency plans for falling back to the Nile. Montgomery ordered these destroyed in front of witnesses. He told his commanders, "You must believe we will win. If you do not believe it, the men will know, and then we are finished." This moment, the burning of retreat plans, became a symbolic rebirth of the Eighth Army. Soldiers heard stories of it within hours. For the first time in months, they felt that someone was taking control. Restoring morale. Montgomery. Among the soldiers. Montgomery knew morale was a weapon. He also knew it was dangerously low. So he did something few British generals had done before. He visited every formation, every camp, every major unit. For days he spoke to soldiers, late at night, early in the morning, under the blazing sun. He talked not about glory, but about survival and victory. Veterans remembered. He told us exactly what would happen. No nonsense, no speeches, just certainty. Montgomery did not flatter his troops. He did not promise an easy battle. He promised a fair battle, one they were prepared for. And in a war full of confusion, that promise meant everything. Reorganizing the army. Structure before action. Montgomery immediately reorganized the Eighth Army in ways that some officers saw as radical. He simplified the chain of command. He dismissed officers he believed were weak, regardless of their rank or reputation. He promoted officers whose clarity and calm under pressure matched his own expectations. He improved the coordination between tank brigades and infantry divisions, a weakness Rommel had exploited repeatedly. He redirected supplies to frontline units. He ensured that every battalion knew its role in the coming battle, and he demanded constant training, even in the scorching desert sun. Montgomery's philosophy was clear. You do not fight the battle. You prepare the battle. Facing Rommel, understanding the enemy. Montgomery respected Rommel more than he respected most Allied generals, though he would never admit it publicly. He studied Rommel's past campaigns, his movements, his unorthodox tactics. He understood that Rommel relied on surprise, rapid exploitation, decentralized decision-making, bold attacks, psychological intimidation. Montgomery identified the flaw in Rommel's brilliance, his reliance on momentum and supply. If the British Army absorbed Rommel's initial blow and prevented him from breaking the line, the Afrika Korps would be forced into a battle of attrition, something Rommel could not sustain. This was the heart of Montgomery's approach. Let Rommel break himself against a prepared defense, then counterattack when he is exhausted. The battle before the battle. Preparing for El Alamein. Montgomery understood that the real battle was not the clash of tanks or the thunder of artillery. It was everything that happened beforehand. He demanded rewiring of communication lines, precise artillery plans, deepening of minefields, rehearsed armored movements, improved desert camouflage-trained night operations, constant reconnaissance flights, coordination with the Desert Air Force. Every unit drilled repeatedly. Every officer received clear directives. Every soldier knew the general's message. We will fight here, and we will win. Montgomery's headquarters became a hive of planning. Maps pinned with colored pins, supply charts updated hourly. Some officers grew frustrated with the endless preparations, but Montgomery believed that in the desert, preparation was survival, clashing with his own staff. Montgomery's bluntness did not endear him to everyone. Some high-ranking officers disliked his tone, his confidence, and his refusal to compromise. He dismissed several senior officers within days of arrival, a move that angered traditionalists but electrified the rank and file. Monty did not care. He valued results over hierarchy. He famously said, "A bad commander costs the lives of good men." He would not allow that. Rommel's absence. The stroke of luck. In one of history's strange ironies, Rommel was not even present in North Africa when Montgomery arrived. The Desert Fox had been sent back to Germany for medical treatment due to chronic illness and exhaustion. This gave Montgomery a rare advantage: time. He used it ruthlessly. While Rommel recovered, Montgomery built the strongest defensive system the British Army had fielded in the Desert War. By the time Rommel returned in late September, Montgomery had fortified the El Alamein line into something entirely different from what the Germans had faced before, building a new identity for the Eighth Army. Montgomery didn't just rebuild the army, he rebranded it. He redesigned the Eighth Army badge. He encouraged soldiers to wear their insignia proudly. He pushed for smarter dress, cleaner lines, better discipline. He wanted the men to feel part of something elite. He wanted them to believe again. A veteran later said, "Monty didn't just plan a battle. He rebuilt our pride." The calm before the storm. By October 1942, the Eighth Army was ready. The air smelled of dust and fuel. The men were exhausted from training, but they were confident. The long retreat was over. Rommel, newly returned to the desert, could feel that something had changed. His intelligence officers reported unusual British activity. Supplies were moving, new tanks, the Sherman, the Grant, were arriving. British artillery positions had multiplied. Patrols were more aggressive. The defensive line looked deeper than ever. Montgomery had not yet attacked, but the battlefield had shifted. It is said that before El Alamein, Rommel walked to a rise in the desert, looked out at the distant British positions, and remarked, "This is a new opponent." He was right. The commander who had arrived just months earlier, stern, disciplined, uncompromising, had reshaped the British Army into a force ready to stand against the Desert Fox. The time for preparation was ending. The time for battle was coming. The desert night was strangely quiet on October 23, 1942. Stars hung low above the endless sands, and a pale moon cast long shadows across the British lines. The Eighth Army waited in stillness. Thousands of men crouched behind minefields, in trenches, beside artillery batteries, beside tanks wrapped in camouflage netting. They were prepared for one of the most important battles of the Second World War. a battle that would define not only the future of North Africa, but the reputation of the man who had rebuilt this army from near ruin. For Bernard Montgomery, the moment had finally arrived. Every hour of training, every meeting, every map, every decision since August had been driving toward this night. El Alamein, the place where he would meet Rommel head-on. But to understand the magnitude of what was about to happen, one must examine Montgomery's plan, a plan carefully designed not for brilliance or surprise, but for inevitability. It was not meant to shock the enemy. It was meant to crush him slowly, methodically, in a way he could not escape. Montgomery was not a gambler. He was a constructor. And El Alamein was his masterpiece, a battlefield chosen by nature. The location of the battle was dictated not by strategy, but by geography. The El Alamein line stretched from the Mediterranean Sea in the north to the vast, impassable Qattara Depression in the south. The depression, a natural barrier of salt marshes and deep sinkholes, made flanking maneuvers impossible. This meant one thing: Rommel could not go around the British. He had to break through them, and Montgomery knew he would not break through. For the first time in the Desert War, Rommel faced an opponent who refused to retreat, refused to panic, and refused to give him the opportunity to exploit gaps. The battlefield would be a narrow, brutal corridor, a perfect place for Montgomery to apply his philosophy of deliberate pressure. Understanding Rommel's weakness. Montgomery studied Rommel like a scientist studies a specimen. He admired the Germans' brilliance for maneuver, but he identified a critical flaw. Rommel's entire system depended on mobility, fuel, and the ability to strike first. Now Rommel was weakened. His logistics were collapsing. His supply lines stretched back to Europe. Allied bombers interfered with supply convoys. German fuel stocks were dangerously low. Italian units were exhausted, reinforcements were scarce. Montgomery understood that Rommel could still fight fiercely, but couldn't outlast a grinding, sustained assault. His plan would exploit precisely that. Montgomery's vision: a battle of attrition, not daring. Many Allied commanders before Montgomery had tried to outmaneuver Rommel. They failed. Montgomery would not repeat their mistakes. He crafted a battle with clear, uncompromising principles. No risky flanking maneuvers, massive artillery superiority, overwhelming infantry support, slow, deliberate advance, absolute clarity for every soldier, step-by-step destruction of enemy units. The goal was not to smash Rommel in a single stroke. That would be foolish and unpredictable. The goal was to dismantle him. Montgomery wanted a battle that was inexorable, a battle that broke the enemy psychologically and physically. A battle Rommel simply could not win, no matter how skillful he was. Operation Lightfoot, the first phase. The opening move of Montgomery's plan was known as Operation Lightfoot. The name carried symbolic meaning. Infantry, light on their feet, would move through minefields that tanks could not cross. The British knew the Germans and Italians had laid vast belts of mines, both anti-tank and anti-personnel, known as the Devil's Gardens. The operation consisted of 2 major infantry attacks clearing 2 safe corridors through minefields, pushing armored divisions through these corridors, confronting Rommel's armor in open ground. This was not easy. Clearing mines under fire at night in desert conditions was one of the most dangerous jobs on the battlefield. Montgomery's plan required precision timing, intense artillery preparation, thousands of engineers, coordinated advances of infantry, armor and artillery, accurate navigation in darkness. The Eighth Army trained repeatedly for this. Every step was rehearsed. Nothing was left to chance. The night before the battle. On the night of October 22nd, 23, as the men waited in the darkness, the desert felt unnaturally calm. Soldiers smoked quietly, officers checked watches, tank engines murmured softly, ready to start at a moment's notice. The anticipation was suffocating. Montgomery drove to the front lines earlier that evening. He did not give a stirring speech. He did not dramatize the coming fight. He simply spoke with calm authority as if tomorrow were already decided. He told them, "This will be a hard battle, but we will win it because we are prepared." The men believed him. His confidence was contagious. Circa October 1942, the opening barrage. At precisely 2040 hours, the desert erupted. More than 800 British artillery guns opened fire simultaneously, lighting up the night sky with waves of thunderous explosions. The sound rolled across the desert like a tide of steel. The ground shook, the air filled with dust and smoke. For 5 full minutes, the barrage roared. German and Italian soldiers stumbled from their positions in confusion, blinded by flashes and choking on sand. Communications broke down. Some units believed the world was ending. This was not a traditional opening salvo. It was a statement. Montgomery wanted the Axis to know. The Eighth Army has returned. The infantry advance. Into the Devil's Gardens. As the sky flickered with artillery fire, British infantry divisions, the 2nd New Zealand, the 9th Australian, the 44th Home Counties, and the 51st Highland, began their advance. Their task? Cross no man's land, enter minefields. Clear paths, mark lanes with white tapes, push forward into German positions. The men moved slowly, carefully, crawling at times, using bayonets and wooden sticks to probe for mines. Explosions echoed as mines detonated under careless steps or artillery shockwaves. This was not glamorous work. It was deadly, exhausting, terrifying. But Montgomery had drilled these men to perfection. They moved with discipline, not panic. The engineers, heroes of the night. Behind the infantry came the engineers, the silent heroes of the first phase. They were armed with wire cutters' explosive charges, mine detectors' long rods, white marker tapes' raw courage. Their job, clear 24-foot wide corridors through the minefields. They worked under machine gun fire, artillery bursts, and the constant threat of hidden mines. Casualties mounted quickly, but the lanes had to be cleared, otherwise the armored divisions could not break through. Montgomery knew the entire operation depended on these corridors. If they were not cleared, the battle would collapse. He had placed some of his best officers in charge of the engineers. He had ensured they had full artillery support. He had planned every step meticulously. And despite the chaos, the lanes began to open. The armored push, slow, brutal progress. Once the lanes were marked, British and Commonwealth tanks, Crusaders, Grants, and the new American-built Shermans, began to crawl forward. But even with cleared paths, progress was slow. German anti-tank guns were deadly. Italian artillery was well positioned. The minefields were deeper than expected. Dust clouds made navigation difficult. The battle lines were confused in the darkness. Montgomery did not panic. He had anticipated resistance. He had planned for setbacks. His operational plan was not dependent on speed. It was dependent on steady pressure. He always believed the side that keeps its head will win. Rommel's return, a commander in crisis. In a twist of fate, Rommel was not in North Africa when the battle began. He was sick in Germany, recovering from exhaustion and a severe sinus infection. When he learned the attack had begun, he rushed back to the desert, arriving on October 25th. When he reached his headquarters, he immediately understood the scale of the situation. The British attack was not a raid. It was not a probing action. It was a full-scale, meticulously planned offensive. Rommel examined the maps. He reviewed reports. He assessed the exhausted condition of his forces. He later wrote, "I realized at once that this was the beginning of the end." Rommel did not give up. He prepared to fight to the last. But the weight of Montgomery's preparation was already pressing on him. Montgomery's patience. The key to victory. For days the battle raged in a grinding, brutal rhythm. Advance a few miles. Hit a wall of resistance. Bring up artillery. Push again. Fall back, regroup, repeat. This was not a glamorous kind of warfare. It was slow. It was exhausting. It was deadly. Some officers urged Montgomery to push harder, Move faster, exploit gaps. He refused. He told his staff, if we rush, we lose control. If we lose control, we lose the battle. His patience frustrated critics, but it saved lives, and won the war. Every night reinforcements arrived. Every day the British tightened the pressure. Every hour Rommel's strength drained further. The breaking point. By the end of October, Rommel's forces were crumbling. Fuel reserves were almost gone. German armor was shattered. Italian divisions were near collapse. Supply lines were failing. Morale was collapsing. Montgomery sensed the moment. On November 2nd, he launched Operation Supercharge, the final blow. This time the armored divisions did not inch forward. They surged. German and Italian units began to withdraw. Rommel sent a message to Berlin begging for permission to retreat. Hitler refused. Rommel ignored him. Montgomery had won. The Battle of El Alamein, the first major British land victory of the war, was a turning point not only for North Africa but for Allied morale worldwide. Churchill said, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Conclusion: the birth of a legend. Montgomery's triumph at El Alamein did not come from brilliance or luck. It came from discipline, preparation, and absolute clarity. He understood the battlefield. He understood his enemy. He understood his men. And in the desert sands of Egypt, he proved to the world and to himself that his methods worked. El Alamein was the battle that made Montgomery a legend. It was the turning point of the Desert War, and it was only the beginning. When the dust began to settle over the smoking battlefield of El Alamein in early November 1942, it was clear that the Desert War had changed forever. Rommel's once formidable Africa Corps, the symbol of German tactical brilliance, was in retreat. For the first time since the campaign began, the British Eighth Army was advancing, not withdrawing, not reacting, but pursuing with confidence, direction, and momentum. Bernard Montgomery had done what many believed impossible only months earlier. He had halted Rommel, defeated him, and prepared to chase him across hundreds of miles of desert. The victory at El Alamein was monumental, but it was not the end. Montgomery understood that the collapse of the Afrika Korps would not happen in a single battle. It would require sustained pressure, unbroken pursuit, and relentless attrition. And so began one of the longest and most dramatic pursuits of the Second World War, a sweeping advance from Egypt all the way to Tunisia, through burning sands, shattered towns, and collapsing Axis positions. It was not only a military feat, it was a psychological triumph that restored pride and belief to an army that had known defeat for too long. A new British army on the move. In the first days after El Alamein, Montgomery reorganized his forces with precision. His soldiers were exhausted, their uniforms covered in sand and sweat, their tanks battered by days of fighting. Yet their spirit was transformed. No longer were they a retreating army. They marched with their heads held high, their steps confident. They felt like victors, and Montgomery knew exactly how important that feeling was. He pushed the Eighth Army forward with deliberate force. The advance had to be methodical. Supply lines extended, fuel delivered, minefields cleared, reconnaissance patrols sent ahead. But it also had to be unrelenting. Any pause gave Rommel time to regroup, reinforce, and dig in. Montgomery ordered rapid follow-up attacks, aggressive reconnaissance, constant harassment of retreating Axis units, coordinated advances along the coast and inland. This was the opposite of the slow, cautious approach some expected. Montgomery understood he had an opportunity to break the enemy completely, and he was not going to waste it. Rommel in retreat, fighting against time, fuel, and fate. Rommel was in a desperate situation. His troops were depleted, his supplies dangerously low, and his defensive lines shattered. His men fought bravely, but they could not stop the relentless British advance. Rommel's reports during this phase were bleak. Fuel shortages crippled his mobility. Long retreats wore out his vehicles. Desert conditions destroyed equipment the Luftwaffe could not provide consistent support. Italian divisions collapsed under pressure. He summarized the situation bluntly. We are fighting a losing battle against material superiority. For all his brilliance, Rommel was powerless without fuel, reinforcements, and air cover. Montgomery's strength was not only his method, it was the vast Allied logistics machine behind him. The desert race toward Somme, Bardia, and Tobruk. As the Eighth Army surged west, they captured strategic positions in rapid succession. 1. Somme. The coastal town fell quickly, as Axis forces attempted to escape further west. British forces found abandoned equipment, destroyed vehicles, and hastily prepared defensive positions. 2. Bardia. The port town, once the site of earlier British defeats, offered little resistance this time. The speed of Montgomery's advance prevented Rommel from building effective defensive lines. 3. Tobruk. The fall of Tobruk in June 1942 had been a devastating blow to British morale. Now, reclaiming it felt like redemption. British soldiers marched into the town with pride, their flags waving, the scars of defeat finally healing. Montgomery understood the symbolic value of Tobruk's recapture. He made sure photographers documented the moment. The message to Britain and the world was clear. The tide has turned. A commander's balance, speed versus caution. Despite the rapid advance, Montgomery was not reckless. He balanced aggression with careful planning. Supply depots were moved forward in stages, damaged tanks were repaired in mobile workshops. Medical units kept pace to treat wounded reconnaissance aircraft, monitored Rommel's movements. Troops were rotated to prevent exhaustion. Montgomery believed that a pursuit was only effective if the pursuing army remained organized. He refused to let victory intoxicate his troops or blind his officers. Every step forward was calculated, even when the Axis forces appeared to be collapsing. This was one of Montgomery's greatest strengths. He could advance quickly without losing control. The Battle of Mersa Matruh. A brief. Stand at Mersa Matruh, Rommel attempted to form a delaying line. His troops dug shallow defenses, emplaced anti-tank guns, and waited. Montgomery's scouts detected the position, and instead of walking into a costly frontal assault, he maneuvered around it, applying pressure elsewhere. The Axis were forced to withdraw once more. Montgomery's philosophy was showing itself clearly. Avoid unnecessary losses. Strike where the enemy is weak. Keep the pressure constant. The challenge of distance. Logistics in the desert. As the Eighth Army advanced deeper into Libya, new challenges emerged. The distances grew longer. More than 400 miles to Benghazi, more than 800 miles to Tripoli. Fuel consumption skyrocketed. Water was precious. Vehicles broke down constantly. The desert was not cooperating. It swallowed tanks, snapped axles, clogged engines with sand. Montgomery's staff officers, under General Freddy de Guingamp, worked miracles to keep the army moving. Supply trucks traveled day and night. Repair teams performed maintenance in the field. Engineers built makeshift roads. It was one of the most impressive logistical feats of the entire war. Without this machine behind him, Montgomery could not have maintained the pursuit. He knew it, and acknowledged it privately. Benghazi falls, Rommel's grip. Weakens Benghazi, a vital port on the Libyan coast, fell to British forces on November 20th. Rommel wanted to hold it longer, but his troops were too depleted. The Afrika Korps was hemorrhaging strength. Montgomery pressed on. The psychological advantage was clear. British soldiers felt unstoppable. Axis troops felt hunted civilians, saw the shifting momentum the world watched with growing hope. What began at El Alamein was turning into a decisive collapse of Axis power in North Africa. Tripoli, the great prize. Montgomery's eyes were set on Tripoli, the capital of Italian Libya, and one of the most important Axis bases in the Mediterranean. Taking Tripoli would mean The collapse of Italian colonial rule in Libya, the loss of a major supply base for Axis, forces a symbolic blow to Mussolini, a critical victory for Allied morale. Rommel knew he could not defend Tripoli. He wrote, "The desert offers no sanctuary, only death for the slow." Montgomery continued forward. January 23, 1943. Tripoli falls. British and Commonwealth troops entered Tripoli to cheering crowds. Photographers captured Montgomery standing in his open-top truck, accepting the applause. It was one of the defining images of the campaign. Churchill telegraphed, "My dear Monty, your achievement is magnificent." For Montgomery, it was validation, proof that his disciplined, methodical approach was superior to Rommel's improvisational brilliance. Operation Torch and the Axis Trap. While Montgomery advanced from the east, the American and British landings in Morocco and Algeria, known as Operation Torch, opened a new front in North Africa. The Axis were now trapped between two Allied armies. The British Eighth Army moving from the east, the American-British First Army pushing from the west. Rommel was caught in a shrinking pocket. This was the first major moment of the war, when the Allies fully coordinated a large, two-front ground operation. Montgomery's pursuit had pushed Rommel into a situation he could no longer control. The trap was closing. The Mareth Line, Rommel's last stand in Tunisia. Rommel retreated into southern Tunisia and took up positions at the historic Mareth Line, a set of fortifications built by the French decades earlier. Montgomery faced a dilemma: attack directly and risk high casualties, maneuver around and risk delays. True to his nature, he prepared meticulously before acting. He launched deception operations, probing attacks, night patrols, artillery bombardments. Then, using terrain knowledge and intelligence reports, he executed a flanking maneuver through the Tabaga Gap. The Mareth Line collapsed. Montgomery had broken Rommel once again. Rommel leaves North Africa, a quiet exit. By March 1943, Rommel's strength was gone. Hitler ordered him back to Europe. He never returned to Africa. His departure marked the symbolic end of the Desert Fox's reign and the rise of Montgomery as the uncontested commander of the Desert War. The Africa Corps fought on without him, but defeat was inevitable. The end of the Desert Campaign. By May 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered. More than 250,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms, a disaster comparable to Stalingrad in scale. It was the end of German ambitions in Africa. It was the end of Mussolini's dreams of empire. It was the end of a 2-year desert war that had stretched across thousands of miles. For Montgomery, it was a triumph unmatched by any British commander since the First World War. He wrote, "The Desert Campaign was a test of endurance. We endured." They did not. Montgomery, after Libya, a commander. Transformed by the end of the Desert Campaign, Montgomery was no longer just a general. He was a symbol, the man who stopped Rommel, the man who gave Britain its first major land victory, the man who marched from El Alamein to Tripoli, the man who commanded an army across an entire continent. His confidence grew. His reputation soared. His belief in his methods strengthened. But this newfound fame also hardened his ego, a trait that would later lead to conflicts with Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton. For now, though, he was the undisputed hero of North Africa. By the summer of 1943, Bernard Montgomery stood at the height of his fame. He had defeated Rommel at El Alamein, driven the Afrika Korps across thousands of miles of desert, and helped deliver one of the most decisive Allied victories of the war. But now he would face a different kind of challenge, one he could not simply overcome with logistics, discipline, or methodical planning. It was the challenge of coalition warfare, allies with different strategies, allies with different personalities, allies with ambitions of their own. The next chapter of Montgomery's wartime career would not be written in the open sands of North Africa, but in the rugged mountains narrow roads, and ancient towns of Sicily and Italy, landscapes that demanded a new kind of combat, and it would not be just a fight against the Germans. It would be, in many ways, a fight for influence, prestige, and leadership within the Allied command. At the center of this new struggle stood Montgomery and the American general George S. Patton, two men so different in style and temperament that their clash was almost inevitable. The road to Sicily, a new Allied strategy. After the fall of Tunisia in May 1943, the Allied leadership, Roosevelt, Churchill, Eisenhower, and the combined chiefs of staff, turned their attention to the next strategic objective. The invasion of northern France was still a distant plan, and the Allies needed to keep pressure on the Axis. Italy, weakened by military failures and political chaos, looked like the next logical target. The Allied plan, known as Operation Husky, called for a large amphibious landing on the southern coast of Sicily, British forces under Montgomery, on the East American forces under Patton on the west, a rapid advance inland toward key ports and airfields. Montgomery supported the idea. He believed that opening a Mediterranean front would destabilize Italy and force Germany to divert troops from the Eastern Front in France. But he also knew that the campaign required unified command and clear objectives, something the Allies often lacked. Monty insisted on simplifying the plan. He argued for fewer landing beaches, tighter coordination, and a more concentrated thrust toward the island's center. Eisenhower accepted many of his suggestions, partly because Montgomery's confidence was overwhelming, and partly because his North African record carried enormous weight. For better or worse, Montgomery arrived in Sicily not only as a commander, but as a man whose reputation influenced Allied strategy. Montgomery and Patton, two commanders, two worlds. If Montgomery was methodical, disciplined, and rigid, George S. Patton was the opposite. Flamboyant, aggressive, instinctive, impulsive, bold. To the point of recklessness, Montgomery wore a black beret and spoke quietly. Patton wore ivory-handled pistols and spoke like a thunderstorm. Montgomery valued preparation. Patton valued momentum. Montgomery believed in slow, calculated advances. Patton believed in striking fast and exploiting chaos. Both men were brilliant, but in different ways. Both men were indispensable, but not compatible. The Sicily campaign would bring them into direct competition. The landings on Sicily, July 9–10, 1943. The invasion began on the night of July 9th, 1943. Stormy seas battered the landing craft. Paratroopers were scattered by strong winds. And yet, despite the chaos, the landings were successful. Montgomery's 8th Army landed near Syracuse, Augusta, and Pacino. His infantry, battle-hardened from North Africa, moved swiftly inland. The terrain was shockingly different from the desert. Steep hills, stone villages, winding mountain roads, narrow passes ripe for ambush. The North African War had been a contest of maneuver. The Sicilian War would be a contest of terrain. Montgomery's advance. Up the eastern coast. Montgomery's immediate goal was to seize Syracuse and push north along the eastern coastal road toward Catania, one of the most vital objectives on the island. Catania offered an important airfield access to the interior control of the main northern route. But the Germans, under General Hans Valentine Hube, understood this perfectly. They fortified the Catania plain with machine gun nests, artillery positions, defensive trenches, rear guard demolitions, well-positioned anti-tank guns. Montgomery's progress slowed. German paratroopers and panzer grenadiers fought with grim determination. Where Rommel had relied on mobility, the German forces in Sicily relied on terrain. Montgomery attacked systematically. Heavy artillery bombardments, night infantry assaults, engineering units, clearing obstacles, armored pushes through key passes. But it was clear, Sicily would not be a quick victory. The clash. With Patton. Diverging paths. While Montgomery fought for Catania, Patton advanced rapidly in the west. His forces captured Gela, Licata, and later Palermo, in a sweeping movement that impressed many Allied officers. Patton moved fast, too fast for Montgomery's taste. Montgomery believed Patton's advance lacked coordination. Patton believed Montgomery's advance was too slow. Tension grew. Reports reached both camps. Each commander viewed the other with increasing suspicion. At one point, Montgomery remarked privately, "Patton is like a good boxer who cannot stop swinging." Patton, hearing of this, retorted, "Monty is not afraid of the Germans. He is afraid of losing his reputation." Their rivalry became part of the campaign's atmosphere. Montgomery wanted unity. Patton wanted initiative. Their differences would shape the rest of Sicily. Catania stalls. The battle for the Etna line. Montgomery's advance toward Catania came to a halt at the Etna line, a series of defensive positions stretching around Mount Etna, Sicily's massive volcano. The Germans held the high ground. Their artillery dominated the passes. Their infantry, well-trained and disciplined, resisted every attack. Montgomery attempted to break through. The Battle of Primosole Bridge. The advance through Lentini repeated pushes toward Gerbini, and Mr. Bianco losses were heavy. The terrain strongly favored the defenders. Montgomery refused to rush. He methodically pressured the line. Meanwhile, Patton, frustrated by the slow pace on the Eastern Front, requested permission from Eisenhower to push north toward Messina along an alternate route. Eisenhower, eager to maintain momentum, agreed. Patton surged forward. Montgomery maintained steady pressure. The race to Messina had begun. The race to Messina. By late July, it became clear that Sicily was turning into an unplanned competition. Patton advancing along the northern coastal road Montgomery, pushing through the more heavily defended eastern passes. Montgomery was fighting the bulk of German forces. Patton faced mostly Italian units and German rearguards. But in the public eye, speed was what mattered, and Patton was faster. Montgomery knew this. It irritated him, but he refused to abandon his method. Pushing recklessly into German strongholds would cost thousands of lives. Patton, however, saw opportunity in movement. He took Palermo, then he swung east. Both armies were converging on Messina. It became a symbol, not of strategy, but of pride. Who reached Messina first? Patton did. His troops entered the city on August 17, 1943. Montgomery's forces arrived shortly after. In the press, Patton received much of the glory. Montgomery did not complain publicly, but he did not hide his irritation. He believed the comparison was unfair. He had faced the strongest German defenses he had taken, the hardest terrain he had preserved his troops. He had coordinated with the broader strategic plan. Patton, for his part, celebrated. But history would later note, the German army executed a brilliant evacuation across the Strait of Messina, saving tens of thousands of troops. Montgomery knew the true measure was not who entered Messina first, but who prevented the German escape. And the truth was, neither commander managed to stop it. The Germans slipped into mainland Italy. Montgomery and Italy, a new type of war. With Sicily secured, the Allies turned toward mainland Italy. Montgomery landed in Calabria on September 3, 1943, the same day Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. But this did not mean the fighting was over. Italy's mountainous terrain was a defender's paradise. Narrow passes, fortified ridges, rivers, and steep valleys, ancient stone towns perched on heights. The German army, under General Kesselring, conducted a masterful delaying campaign. Montgomery's advance slowed dramatically. The open desert, where he could maneuver armies freely, was gone. Italy was a fortress of natural defenses. He wrote, "Italy is the opposite of the desert. Every hill is a fortress." Progress was slow. German demolitions destroyed bridges and roads. Rain-turned paths into mud transport struggled in steep terrain. Infantry faced constant ambushes. Artillery was hard to position. Montgomery advanced from Calabria toward Potenza, and the interior, but the campaign became a grind, far from the fluid warfare he preferred. Transfer to the United Kingdom. In late 1943, Montgomery's role in Italy came to an abrupt end. He was recalled to Britain to take command of 21st Army Group, the massive force that would lead the invasion of Normandy. It was both a promotion and a strategic necessity. The coming invasion of France required a commander with clarity, discipline, meticulous planning, morale-building ability. Proven leadership under pressure, Montgomery was the natural choice. Eisenhower, now Supreme Commander of the coming D-Day invasion, respected Montgomery despite their disagreements. He needed someone who could unite British and Canadian forces, and who could command the admiration of British soldiers. Montgomery left Italy behind, but he carried lessons with him. The importance of terrain, the difficulty of coalition warfare, the need for diplomacy among allies, the challenge of balancing speed with caution. These lessons would shape the next and most famous chapter of his military career. Conclusion: Montgomery's transformation. The Sicily and Italy campaigns transformed Montgomery in new ways. He saw how different types of terrain challenged even the best plans. He learned how coalition politics shaped strategy. He clashed with Patton, a rivalry that would echo through history. He maintained his methodical style, even when others pushed for speed. He added experience in amphibious operations, mountain warfare, and urban combat. Montgomery left Italy not as the desert hero he had been, but as a commander preparing for the greatest test of the war, Normandy. When Bernard Montgomery returned to Britain in the winter of 1943, the country he found was not the same one he had left. London still carried scars of the Blitz. Air raid shelters dotted parks and fields. Entire neighborhoods bore wounds of fire and rubble. Yet, there was also a feeling of momentum, a sense that the war had entered a decisive phase. The Allies had seized North Africa, taken Sicily, pushed into Italy, and secured control of the Atlantic. Now, the greatest task of the war lay ahead: the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The operation that would become known as D-Day, and formerly Operation Overlord, required more planning, more coordination, more logistics, and more leadership than any military effort in modern history. It was the largest amphibious assault the world would ever see, involving thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, an enormous air armada, and a level of inter-allied cooperation that had never been attempted. And at the center of this effort, standing beside Eisenhower, was Bernard Montgomery. His task: to shape the ground plan to unite British, Canadian, and American forces, and to command the land battle once the invasion began. For Monty, this was the opportunity of a lifetime, and the challenge that would test every aspect of his character. The recall to Britain. A turning point, Montgomery was surprised when he received orders to leave Italy. He had expected to continue fighting up the peninsula, but the High Command had other plans. His performance in North Africa and his discipline in Sicily made him the ideal candidate for the most important responsibilities in the coming invasion. Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe, respected Montgomery's clarity, his ability to inspire morale, and his skill at building structure in chaos. But Ike also knew that Monty was difficult. Brilliant, yes. Indispensable, probably. But a diplomat? Not at all. Still, Eisenhower wanted him. He needed him. Montgomery's job was twofold: take command of the 21st Army Group, the main ground force invading France, shape the operational plan for the landings. Monty accepted instantly. He had been preparing for a battle like this his whole life. The first meetings. Montgomery takes the stage. In January 1944, the senior Allied planners gathered at St. Paul's School in London, now converted into a headquarters. Maps covered the hallways. Boards displayed enemy positions. Desks overflowed with charts, troop tables, and intelligence reports. Montgomery entered wearing his black beret and trademark calm expression. Officers straightened. Conversations stopped. Even among Americans who did not yet know him well, his reputation had preceded him. Monty studied the maps in silence. Then he spoke, and everything changed. His first criticism was devastating. "Gentlemen, the plan as it stands is completely unworkable." He argued that the landing beaches were too narrow. The initial assault divisions were spread too thin. The objectives lacked strategic cohesion. The follow-up forces were insufficient. The plan underestimated German defenses. The Allies needed a broader front. This was classic Montgomery: blunt, unapologetic, and correct. Some American generals bristled, others admired his courage. Eisenhower listened carefully. Montgomery proposed a new approach: widen the landing areas, strengthen the assault divisions, secure Caen early, push inland, quickly avoid the mistakes of Gallipoli and Dieppe, prepare overwhelming logistics for the breakout phase. Within days, the plan shifted. Within weeks, it bore Montgomery's signature, Montgomery's great talent, bringing order to chaos. Montgomery's critics often focused on his ego, his inflexibility, and his tendency to take credit. But there was another side, a side crucial to Overlord. He had an unmatched ability to bring clarity. The invasion required the British Second Army, the Canadian First Army, the U.S. First Army, dozens of specialized units, multiple airborne divisions, coordination with naval and air forces. Joint operations with the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy, cooperation among Canadian, Polish, Free French, Belgian, Norwegian forces. Each had its own structure, commanders, traditions. Montgomery imposed unity. His method was simple: clear objectives, simple plans, precise roles for every unit, no ambiguity. Personal visits to every formation. He toured camps, inspected divisions, and spoke to soldiers. His words were consistent: "I will not waste your lives. We will be prepared. We will win, because our plan will be flawless." Veterans remembered these visits decades later. Montgomery's presence gave them confidence. The conflicts with American generals. Montgomery's personality did not blend easily with the Americans. They admired his tactical brilliance, but found him condescending. Monty often spoke as if he alone understood the situation, which irritated officers who had fought hard battles in North Africa and Italy. His main conflicts during planning were with General Omar Bradley, calm, methodical, cooperative, but quietly resentful of Monty's authority; General George Patton, fiery, aggressive, and fiercely proud. Monty considered him reckless; General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, who found Monty insufferable. The disagreements were often sharp. Bradley recalled, "Montgomery had a habit of lecturing us as school children." Patton wrote in his diary, "Monty is a very able soldier, but a very difficult teammate." Eisenhower acted as a mediator. He understood that Montgomery's brilliance came attached to a difficult personality. But for all the friction, the Allied plan slowly took shape, and it was sound. Planning the beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau. Sword Montgomery had strong opinions on the choice of beaches and the sequence of attacks. He insisted on 2 American beaches, Utah and Omaha, 3 British and Commonwealth beaches, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Airborne landings on both flanks, rapid establishment of beachheads, immediate push toward Caen. The Germans were strongest near Caen. Montgomery chose to fight them head-on. He believed that holding the eastern flank at Caen would allow the Americans in the west to break out later. This became the core of the Overlord strategy. British and Canadians fix the German panzer divisions. Americans break out into open country. It was a simple plan, clearly divided, with unified purpose. Montgomery pushed it with relentless determination. The airborne divisions, the plan of the flanks. Montgomery supported the use of 2 airborne divisions, the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne on the western flank, the British 6th Airborne on the eastern flank. Their missions: secure bridges, block German reinforcements, hold causeways and roads, create confusion in enemy lines. Montgomery insisted that airborne troops were essential to prevent German counterattacks in the first critical hours. His argument was blunt. We cannot allow the Germans to push us back into the sea. The Americans and British planners agreed. Montgomery's daily routine: intensity and order. During the months of planning, Montgomery worked with his trademark discipline. His routine was famously structured: up early briefings at strict times, map sessions. Late into the night, staff officers expected to keep up, commanders required to attend daily updates. He hated inefficiency. He hated ambiguity. He hated delays. Montgomery demanded precise information: tides, wind, direction, moon phases, German troop movements, tank numbers, replacement reserves, logistics tables, supply flow charts, air support availability. His headquarters was a world of maps, charts, and careful preparation. Everyone worked at Monty's pace, or they were replaced. The problem of Caen, a controversial objective. Montgomery believed that Caen, the gateway to Normandy's interior, had to be captured early, preferably on D-Day itself. It would serve as a staging ground, a protective anchor for the British flank, a magnet for German panzer reserves. This idea frustrated some American planners. They believed Montgomery was allocating too many resources to his own sector. But Monty stood firm. He explained, "The Germans will strike the British, not the Americans. I will hold them. You will break out." History proved this correct. The Germans indeed concentrated their panzer divisions against Montgomery, protecting their eastern flank, while the Americans eventually broke out at St. Lo. The weather problem. By late May 1944, everything was ready. Troops assembled ships filled with supplies, landing craft, positioned paratroopers, briefed tanks, waterproofed naval guns, ready bombers loaded. The invasion window opened on June 5th. But the English Channel turned violent. Storms rolled in. Winds rose. Waves battered the fleet. Eisenhower called his commanders together. Montgomery, looking at the weather charts, advised caution, but pushed for action if even a small window opened. On June 5th at midnight, the meteorologists reported a brief improvement. Eisenhower turned to Montgomery. Montgomery nodded. The decision was made. Okay, we'll go. D-Day was set for June 6, 1944. Montgomery's final message to the troops. On the eve of the invasion, Montgomery delivered a message to all soldiers under his command. We go forward together. Our strength lies in our unity. The eyes of the world are upon us. We will not fail. His words spread across camps, ships, airfields. They were printed in leaflets, read aloud by officers, pinned on notice boards. For the British and Canadian soldiers who had followed him from El Alamein to Sicily, his presence was reassuring. For the American troops, it was a reminder that they were part of something vast, a global force poised to strike at Nazi tyranny. Montgomery, on the morning of D-Day. On June 6, 1944, as thousands of ships crossed the Channel, Montgomery stood in his command vehicle at his headquarters in Portsmouth. He was calmer than most. He trusted the plan. Reports flooded in: landings at Utah, successful Omaha struggling with heavy fire gold, Juneau, sword-making progress airborne divisions fighting for bridges. German response still unclear. Montgomery coordinated artillery, air support, reinforcements. He kept the East strong. He held the line. By sunset, the Allies had secured all 5 beaches. It was not easy. It was not perfect. It was not without heavy casualties. But it was a success. The largest amphibious invasion in history had landed. Montgomery's structure held. The plan worked. Conclusion: the architect of Overlord. Preparing for D-Day was the greatest military task Montgomery ever undertook. It demanded diplomacy, cooperation, discipline, vision, logistics, leadership, meticulous planning. Montgomery brought all of these, along with his flaws, pride, rigidity, ego. But the outcome was undeniable. He shaped Overlord. He gave it clarity and cohesion. He held together a multinational force. He built the plan that got the Allies onto the shores of France. D-Day was not his battle alone, but it bore his imprint everywhere. Now the next challenge awaited, the Battle for Normandy. When the sun rose over the beaches of Normandy on June 7, 1944, the world's greatest invasion force had already secured a foothold that would change the course of history. But although D-Day was over, the real battle was only beginning. The weeks that followed would test every decision Montgomery had made during the planning of Overlord, and would reveal both the brilliance and the limitations of his style. Normandy was not the open desert where Montgomery had built his reputation. It was not the rolling plains of northern France where tanks could maneuver freely. It was a nightmare of hedgerows, tall, dense, ancient walls of earth and vegetation known as bocage, which turned every field into a fortress. It was a landscape perfectly designed to slow advances, hide defenders, and multiply casualties. Montgomery entered Normandy confident in his plan, but the battle ahead would challenge him in ways he had never experienced. Through fierce German counterattacks, disagreements with American commanders, harsh scrutiny from the press, and the frustration of slow, grinding progress. The day after D-Day, holding the line. Montgomery's first responsibility after the landings was to consolidate the Allied position. This required linking all 5 beachheads, securing supply routes, repelling German counterattacks, bringing reinforcements ashore. The Germans reacted quickly. Panzer divisions moved toward Caen. SS units, including elite formations like the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, began launching ferocious attacks. Montgomery's defensive plan held. The beachheads were secure. The Allies were not driven back into the sea. Yet the cost was high. Omaha Beach alone had suffered devastating losses. The British and Canadians faced some of the most fanatic German resistance of the entire war. Montgomery knew he needed to stabilize the front before attempting any major offensive. The battle for Caen, Montgomery's most controversial objective. From the very beginning of Overlord, Montgomery had identified Caen as the key to the entire campaign. Caen was a road network hub, the gateway to the open plains of northern France, a vital objective that could anchor the Allied left flank. His plan was simple. The British and Canadians would seize Caen quickly. The Germans would commit their panzer divisions to defend it. The Americans, facing fewer armored units in the west, would break out toward Brittany in the interior. The idea was correct. The execution, however, was far harder than expected. German resistance was fierce. Every ridge, every village, every hedgerow was fortified. The SS refused to yield ground. Weather conditions slowed air support. Minefields, snipers, and anti-tank positions multiplied. Montgomery's forces fought their way toward Caen in a series of grinding, bloody battles. Le Bessay Woods, Bouron, Courseulles-sur-Mer, Carpiquet Airfield. The Germans held firm. Critics said Montgomery was moving too slowly. Supporters said he was absorbing the German strength exactly as planned. The truth was somewhere in between. Montgomery's strategy was sound, but the price was heavy. Operation Epsom. The first major push toward Caen, June 26-30. By late June, Montgomery launched the first major attempt to break through German lines west of Caen. Operation Epsom was designed to cross the Odon River, seize high ground south of Caen outflank. The city stretch German reserves. The battle was brutal. Rain turned fields into mud. British infantry suffered under relentless German mortar and artillery fire. The SS counterattacked with Tigers and Panthers. For days, the fighting seesawed. Units like the 15th Scottish Division and 11th Armored Division fought with extraordinary determination. By June 30th, Montgomery halted the offensive. He had not captured Caen, but he had done something else, something strategically critical. He forced the Germans to commit nearly all their panzer divisions to the Caen sector. Hitler and the German High Command believed the decisive Allied blow must come from the British. They were wrong, and Montgomery knew they were wrong. The American breakout begins to form. While Montgomery fought the SS near Caen, the Americans faced fewer armored divisions in the west. Omar Bradley's troops, though slowed by hedgerows, had more opportunities to maneuver. Montgomery's strategy was working, but few people recognized it at the time. The Allied press judged success by maps, not by enemy force concentration. And on the map, the British lines around Caen seemed stubbornly static. Operation Charnwood, the northern half of Caen Falls, July 8th to 9th. Montgomery launched Charnwood in early July. British and Canadian divisions advanced under heavy artillery and air support. The Germans fought with their usual ferocity, but they could no longer hold the northern part of the city. British troops entered Caen on July 9th. Montgomery had expected to seize the entire city earlier. But the reality of German resistance made the fight far more costly and prolonged than planned. Operation Goodwood, the Armored Thrust, July 18th to 20. Goodwood was Montgomery's boldest armored operation in Normandy. He launched more than 1,000 tanks into a sweeping advance east of Caen. The goals were break through German lines, seize key villages, fix German armor, force the enemy to commit reserves. The advance achieved local success, but met devastating fire from German anti-tank guns and well-positioned armor. The 11th Armored Division suffered heavy losses. Smoke and dust limited visibility. Some British tanks advanced too quickly and isolated themselves. Goodwood did not produce the dramatic breakthrough some expected, but, again, strategically, it achieved something vital. It kept the German panzer divisions locked in place around Caen. Montgomery later said, "Goodwood was not intended to break through. It was intended to fix the German armor." And it did. Critics disagreed. Newspapers called the advance disappointing. American generals thought Monty was too cautious. But behind the scenes, Montgomery knew the real breakthrough was imminent, and it would not come from his army. It would come from Bradley and Patton. The American breakout. Operation Cobra, July 25th, 31. By late July, the German lines in the west were stretched thin. Where British and Canadian troops faced Tigers and Panthers, American troops faced overextended infantry divisions with little armored support. Bradley launched Operation Cobra on July 25th. The effect was explosive. A massive aerial bombardment shattered German defenses near Saint-Lô. American infantry surged forward. Armored divisions burst into open country. Patton's newly activated Third Army then exploited the breakthrough, racing across Brittany and the French interior. Suddenly, the Americans were moving at lightning speed, and now the picture became clear. Everything that had happened around Caen, the slow, grinding battles, had pinned the German armor in place. Montgomery's strategy worked. He had taken the hard fight. He had taken the pressure. He had taken the criticism. But the breakthrough that would liberate France was happening everywhere because of the foundation he built, the Falaise Pocket, the encirclement opportunity. As the Americans surged, the Germans began retreating east. Montgomery saw an opportunity to close the German army in Normandy, to trap them in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. He ordered the Canadians to attack south from Caen, the Americans to attack north from Argentan, the Polish 1st Armored Division to cut escape routes near Chambois. The goal: encircle and annihilate the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. The fighting was savage. Canadian and Polish divisions suffered heavy losses trying to close the gap. American units encountered desperate German counterattacks. The Germans, trapped, attempted to break out in chaos. On August 20th, the pocket closed. It was one of the most decisive victories in the entire European campaign. Over 50,000 German troops were captured. Thousands more were killed. German armor was destroyed. The German hold on Normandy collapsed. Critics would later argue whether Montgomery closed the pocket fast enough. But history is clear. The German army in Normandy was destroyed. The road to Paris and then to Germany was open. The press and public opinion, Monty under fire. Throughout the Normandy campaign, Montgomery faced harsh press criticism. Too slow, too cautious, too defensive. Caen not captured on time. Montgomery's stubborn personality made him a target. He often appeared arrogant in interviews. He took credit boldly. He dismissed criticism sharply. But even his critics admitted that. He never panicked. He never lost control. He never wasted lives recklessly. He never allowed the Germans to regain the initiative. Montgomery fought a battle of attrition, not a battle of speed. It was the battle Normandy demanded. The reality of bocage warfare. A soldier's nightmare. Montgomery understood something many journalists did not. Normandy was one of the most difficult landscapes in Europe for offensive operations. The hedgerows were centuries old, absorbed tank shells, hid machine guns, blocked visibility, forced infantry to advance field by field, neutralized many armored tactics. German paratroopers, SS units, and seasoned infantry used the bocage expertly. They turned every farm, every ditch, every road bend into a strong point. Montgomery's plan required patience. And he had patience. It infuriated some. But it saved lives and ultimately won the campaign. Victory in Normandy, Montgomery's finest hour? By late August 1944, the Allies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were racing toward Belgium. The German army was in full retreat. Montgomery's role was enormous. He held the eastern flank, he pinned all German armor, he shaped the operational plan, he ensured unity of command, he provided strategic direction. He maintained pressure until the Americans broke through. The Normandy campaign was messy, slow, bloody, controversial. But it succeeded. Montgomery did what he promised. He held the Germans. He wore them down. He enabled the breakout. Normandy set the stage for the next, even more ambitious Allies operations, and for the most controversial chapter of Montgomery's career, Operation Market Garden. By September 1944, Montgomery was riding the momentum of the Normandy victory. German forces were in retreat across France and Belgium. Paris had been liberated. Antwerp captured. The Allies had crossed the Seine and were pushing toward the German border. Spirits were high. Confidence was soaring. The war felt close to ending. Yet, despite the celebrations, Montgomery saw a problem that many others overlooked. The Allied armies were advancing broad front, stretching supply lines dangerously thin. Fuel shortages crippled momentum. Armored divisions waited for days with empty tanks. Artillery units rationed shells. Trucks carrying vital supplies struggled across destroyed roads. Montgomery believed he had the answer. A single bold stroke. A thrust straight into the heart of Germany. A decisive blow that might end the war by Christmas. This plan would become known as Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne assault in history, and also Montgomery's most controversial decision. The strategic argument, broad front versus single thrust. Eisenhower favored a broad front advance, giving equal resources to American, British, and Canadian armies. This approach spread risk and maintained pressure. Montgomery disagreed. He believed the Allies didn't have enough supplies to advance everywhere. They needed one strong spearhead, not many weak pushes. The British 21st Army Group, closest to the Rhine, should deliver that spearhead. American forces in the south faced tougher terrain in the Ardennes. He pressed his view relentlessly. Montgomery argued, "Give me the supplies, and I will end the war." Eisenhower reluctantly agreed to support Montgomery's next offensive, but not with unlimited resources. Montgomery decided to make his move immediately. The plan. A bridge too far Operation Market Garden consisted of two parts: Market, the airborne assault. 3 airborne divisions would land deep behind enemy lines. 101st Airborne, near Eindhoven. 82nd Airborne, near Nijmegen. 1st British Airborne Division near Arnhem. Their mission: capture bridges over the Maas, Waal, and Rhine rivers. Garden, the ground advance. The British XXX Corps would advance along a single narrow road from Belgium to Arnhem, linking up with the airborne troops. If successful, the Allies would cross the Rhine, enter northern Germany, bypass the Siegfried Line, split German defenses, open the road to the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart. It was audacious, it was ambitious, it relied heavily on timing, and it depended entirely on everything going right. Montgomery believed it could succeed. The risks, known but underestimated. Even Montgomery admitted privately that the plan carried enormous risk. The list of dangers was long. The ground advance depended on one road, elevated and exposed. If Germans blocked it, the whole offensive would stall. Airborne troops risked isolation. Arnhem was far. The paratroopers there would need to hold for at least 48 hours. Intelligence reports showed German SS Panzer divisions refitting near Arnhem. Weather could delay reinforcements. Terrain was marshy and restricted maneuver. Montgomery acknowledged the dangers, but dismissed them as manageable. He believed speed and surprise would compensate. This was uncharacteristic of Monty, the man known for caution and preparation. Some historians argue that his growing fame after Normandy inflated his confidence. What is certain is this: Market Garden was far riskier than any operation Montgomery had led before. September 17, 1944. The airborne assault begins. At 10 in the morning, the skies above Holland filled with thousands of aircraft. It was one of the most magnificent sights of the war. Troop carriers, gliders, escort fighters, parachutes opening across the sky. Civilians stood in fields and wept with joy. The Dutch believed liberation had arrived at last. 101st Airborne captured most of their bridges around Eindhoven, though one key bridge at Son was destroyed. 82nd Airborne captured the Groesbeek Heights, but failed to take the vital Nijmegen Bridge on the first day. 1st British Airborne Division landed near Arnhem, but far too far from the bridge. Only one battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, reached the Arnhem Bridge and held its northern end. The rest of the division was delayed by unexpected German resistance. SS units positioned closer than intelligence claimed communication failures in radios scattered drop zones. The battle for Arnhem had begun, and it was a race against time. The ground advance, problems from the start. XXX Corps, under General Brian Horrocks, began advancing up the single narrow road. At first, progress was promising, but soon, delays accumulated. German units destroyed bridges, anti-tank guns, ambushed British armor. The road was constantly blocked by Rex tanks could not maneuver off the road. Due to marshy ground traffic jams stretched for miles, supply vehicles struggled to keep up. Montgomery's plan needed perfect timing. Instead, it became a chain reaction of slowdowns. By the time XXX Corps reached Nijmegen, the 82nd Airborne was struggling to hold positions against fierce German counterattacks. The Nijmegen Bridge remained in enemy hands for 2 days. That delay proved catastrophic. Arnhem, the bridge too far. The 1st British Airborne Division faced a nightmare. They had landed too far from the bridge. German SS units were far stronger than expected. Communication between units was poor. Reinforcements were delayed by constant fighting. Frost's battalion held the northern end of the bridge with extraordinary courage. They repelled tank attacks. They fought house to house. They refused to surrender, but they were surrounded. When their ammunition ran out, Frost's men fought on with small arms and grenades. Many were captured, others were killed. Farther west, the remainder of the division held Oosterbeek, against overwhelming odds. They dug in. They repelled assaults for days. They waited for relief that never came. Operation Market Garden had promised salvation within 48 hours. They held for 9 days, the final attempt to reach Arnhem. By the time the Nijmegen Bridge was finally captured, XXX Corps rushed toward Arnhem. But the delay had been too costly. The road north of Nijmegen became a battlefield. Flooded fields, German artillery SS reinforcements, desperate counterattacks. By the time British tanks were within a few miles of Frost's position, the airborne troops had already been overrun. Montgomery ordered a last attempt to relieve the survivors in Oosterbeek. It failed. On September 25th, the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division were withdrawn across the Rhine under cover of darkness. Of the 10,000 men who landed near Arnhem, only 2,000 returned. The division was effectively destroyed. Was it Montgomery's fault? A complex answer. Historians still debate whether Market Garden was doomed from the start. Montgomery's mistakes. He ignored intelligence about SS Panzer presence near Arnhem. He placed airborne troops too far from their objectives. He relied on a single road for the armored advance. He underestimated German resilience. He overestimated the ability of airborne troops to hold isolated positions. Other factors. Poor intelligence sharing rigid airborne drop schedules. Weather delays, limited transport aircraft, German skill in rapid counterattacks terrain, unsuitable for armored exploitation. Montgomery later defended himself, saying, "The plan was sound, the execution was not." But this statement glosses over the reality. The plan was deeply flawed, even if parts of it were feasible. The aftermath, Montgomery's reputation. Takes a hit. Market Garden damaged Montgomery's reputation more than any other battle of the war. British press reaction mixed. Some admired the daring. Others questioned his judgment. American reaction critical. Many saw the operation as Montgomery trying to outshine Patton and force the war to end on British terms. Eisenhower's view diplomatic. He publicly supported Montgomery but privately expressed frustration. Despite the failure, Montgomery kept his position. Eisenhower valued him too much to remove him. The British public still saw him as the hero of El Alamein, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Montgomery was no longer invincible, no longer the flawless commander. Market Garden revealed his limits, his overconfidence, his difficulty working with allies, his inability to adapt rapidly when things went wrong. It was a turning point in his wartime legacy. Yet, Market Garden achieved something important. This is often forgotten. The Allies seized large parts of the Netherlands. They secured key ground that would later support the 1945 offensives. They drew German reserves away from the Ardennes. They inflicted significant casualties on elite German formations. Market Garden failed in its strategic goal, but it was not meaningless. Still, it came at a terrible cost. Montgomery's reflection. Montgomery rarely admitted mistakes, but Market Garden forced him to reflect more deeply than usual. Years later, he wrote, "In war, many plans fail. What matters is that one learns and adapts." He learned. He adapted. And in the final phase of the war, he would play a critical role in stopping the German Ardennes offensive and leading the Allied left flank into Germany. But Market Garden would remain the shadow in his story, the daring gamble that proved too daring, the promise too great, the bridge truly too far. December 1944. The war in Europe seemed to be approaching its inevitable conclusion. Paris was liberated. Antwerp was in Allied hands. The German army was battered, retreating, demoralized. Many American and British soldiers believed that Christmas would be spent in peace, perhaps even at home. Then, on the morning of December 16th, the Eastern Front erupted with the last, desperate gamble of Adolf Hitler, a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. It was the largest German attack on the Western Front since 1940, and it caught the Allies completely off guard. This event would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, and in its darkest hours, it would be Bernard Montgomery who stepped into the leadership vacuum, and whose decisions, though controversial, helped avert disaster. The German attack, thunder in the Ardennes. The Ardennes was considered quiet, too densely wooded, too cold, too unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. The Allies believed the Germans incapable of anything more than local, defensive actions. They were wrong. Hitler had secretly assembled 200,000 troops, nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, thousands of artillery pieces, elite SS Panzer divisions, paratroopers, special infiltration units disguised as Americans. Their goal was audacious: smash through the thin American lines, cross the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, split the British and American armies, force a negotiated peace in the West. On December 16th at dawn, the sky erupted with artillery fire. Fog rolled across the frozen forests. American outposts vanished under German assault. Entire divisions were thrown into chaos. Within 48 hours, the front line bulged violently westward, hence the name of the battle. Eisenhower realized the gravity of the situation. This was not a local attack. This was a crisis. The American struggle, courage under collapse. The initial German blow fell on the U.S. First Army. Young, inexperienced American divisions faced overwhelming force. Roads filled with retreating columns. Communication broke down. Some units were surrounded. Others resisted desperately. The stand of American forces was heroic. The 99th Infantry Division near Elsenborn Ridge, the defenders of St. Vith, the famous 101st Airborne at Bastogne. But leadership at the higher levels was faltering. General Courtney Hodges, commander of the U.S. First Army, was overwhelmed. His staff was confused. Reports were contradictory, and the front line was changing by the hour. Eisenhower realized he needed someone to take operational control of the northern sector, someone calm under pressure, someone who could impose order on chaos, someone with experience managing large formations under crisis. He had only one option: Montgomery. December 20th, 1944, Montgomery takes command of the Northern Front. On December 20th, Eisenhower made a dramatic decision. He placed Montgomery in command of all American forces north of the German penetration, including the U.S. First Army, the U.S. Ninth Army. This meant nearly 250,000 American troops now fell under Montgomery's direction. It was a bold move, a political risk, but Eisenhower trusted Montgomery's ability to create structure from disorder. Monty immediately assumed control. His first steps were classic Montgomery. 1. He stabilized the line. He ordered a firm defensive posture, reinforcing key positions and preventing further retreat. 2. He reorganized command. He replaced panicked officers, restored communication, and consolidated fragmented units. 3. He created a clear operational plan. Montgomery established the defensive perimeter around the Meuse River, crossings the Elsenborn Ridge, the northern shoulder of the German advance 4. He visited frontline units. American soldiers later remembered Montgomery's presence. He walked calmly, spoke clearly, and made us feel the situation was under control. This confidence was exactly what the crisis required. Understanding Montgomery's approach. Montgomery's strategy was simple and effective. Hold the northern shoulder. If the Germans could not widen the northern side of their advance, they would become trapped in a funnel. Allow the Germans to overextend themselves. Their supply lines were already stretched thin. Prepare for a counteroffensive at the right moment. Not too early, not too late. It was a defensive mindset, one some Americans disliked, but it was the right one. Montgomery was not fighting the Desert War anymore. This was winter in forests against elite German armored divisions. Any reckless counterattack would have ended in disaster. Eisenhower's view: relief and trust. Despite some internal political pressure, Eisenhower stood firmly behind Montgomery's leadership. In private, he said, "Monty is the only man who can bring order to this situation." Eisenhower knew Montgomery's strengths. He did not panic. He imposed structure. He communicated clearly. His soldiers trusted him. He made conservative but correct decisions. And during the Bulge, these strengths were essential. The battle at the northern shoulder, one of Montgomery's most important achievements during the Bulge, was the defense of the Elsenborn Ridge. This ridge was the key to preventing German tanks from breaking through to Liège and Antwerp. Under Montgomery's operational guidance, American units held, despite being outnumbered under heavy artillery bombardment in brutal winter conditions while facing elite SS Panzer units. Their stand was one of the most heroic actions of the war, and Montgomery ensured they received reinforcements, artillery support, and clear orders. Without this defense, the German offensive might have succeeded. Montgomery's counteroffensive. January 3, 1945. By late December, the German advance was failing. They were low on fuel. Their losses were catastrophic. Their timetable was shattered. Montgomery saw the moment. On January 3rd, he launched a coordinated counterattack. British XXX Corps from the North, U.S. 1st, and 9th Armies from the West. It was not a rapid blitz. It was deliberate, overwhelming, and controlled. Typical Montgomery. The Germans began to collapse. Hitler's last gamble on the Western Front had failed. The controversy. Montgomery's press conference. On January 7th, Montgomery held a press conference to explain the battle. He praised the Americans for their bravery and endurance. But he also implied, unintentionally or not, that it was his leadership that had saved the situation. American generals, especially Patton and Bradley, were furious. They believed Montgomery had exaggerated his role, taken credit for U.S. sacrifices, minimized American initiative, presented himself as the hero of the battle. The controversy spread quickly. Newspapers twisted his words. Officers whispered complaints. Patton wrote in his diary, "Monty is insufferable, always the hero in his own eyes." Even Eisenhower was displeased, though he did not reprimand Montgomery publicly. Was the criticism fair? Historians remain divided. Arguments against Montgomery. His press conference was poorly worded. He did present the story with too much focus on his decisions. He lacked the sensitivity needed for coalition warfare. His pride alienated American allies. Arguments in his defense. His decisions in the northern sector were correct. He prevented a catastrophic breakthrough. He reorganized a collapsing front. He stabilized the situation during the most critical phase. Eisenhower deliberately chose him for his calm under crisis. The truth. Montgomery played a crucial military role, but handled the political fallout poorly. The final phase. Driving the Germans back. Throughout January 1945, Montgomery's armies continued pushing the Germans back from the Bulge. The winter was harsh. Snow froze weapons. Frostbite crippled units. But the Allied advance never stopped. By late January, the front line was restored. The German army had suffered massive losses: men, tanks, morale. Hitler's strategic reserve was ruined. The Wehrmacht would never again mount a major offensive in the West. Montgomery's calm leadership during the crisis had helped ensure this outcome. The Bulge and Montgomery's legacy Operation Market Garden had damaged his reputation. The Battle of the Bulge militarily repaired much of it, but politically, his press conference reopened old wounds. Montgomery had always struggled with diplomacy. He was brilliant in planning, disciplined in execution, but clumsy in public statements and unaware of how others perceived him. Still, in the eyes of many historians, his role in the Bulge was indispensable. Strategically, he was right. The northern defense had to hold the line, had to be stabilized. The counterattack had to wait. Rash action would have been fatal. Operationally, he succeeded. He preserved American forces. He coordinated reinforcements. He created strategic clarity. He prevented a collapse of the front politically. He failed. He alienated allies. He appeared boastful. He mishandled the narrative. Montgomery was a commander of contrasts, a man capable of saving a battlefield, yet losing a political argument in a single sentence. The Battle of the Bulge would be his final major test before the Allied armies crossed the Rhine into Germany. And in that next chapter, the final chapter of the war, Montgomery would once again find himself at the center of strategy, leadership, and controversy. By early 1945, the collapse of Germany was no longer a question of if, but when. The Allies had repelled Hitler's last gamble in the Ardennes. The Eastern Front was devouring German divisions at a catastrophic rate. The skies belonged to Allied aircraft, and before the Western Allies stood the final great barrier into the heart of Germany, the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had been Germany's shield, broad, fast-flowing, difficult to cross, lined with fortifications. It was not just a physical barrier, but a psychological one. Every German schoolchild had grown up hearing that no enemy army could cross the Rhine into the homeland. Bernard Montgomery intended to shatter that belief once and for all. The final phase of the European War would demonstrate Montgomery's greatest strengths: meticulous planning, overwhelming preparation, careful execution, and also reignite controversies surrounding Allied leadership and strategy. Montgomery would organize one of the largest river-crossing operations in history. He would lead the final Allied push into northern Germany, and he would stand in the spotlight once more, praised and criticized in equal measure. This is the story of how he helped bring the war in Europe to its end. The situation in early 1945. A battlefield reshaped. After the Battle of the Bulge, the Allied lines stabilized. The Germans were exhausted. Hitler refused to retreat. Entire divisions were sacrificed in futile defenses. The Western Front stretched from the Dutch border down to Alsace, but the strategic focus was clear: cross the Rhine, break into Germany, end the war. Three major Allied army groups prepared for the final thrust: Bradley's 12th U.S. Army Group, Devers' 6th U.S. Army Group, Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Montgomery's forces held the northern sector, closest to the Netherlands and the lower Rhine. This region contained flat, open terrain, ideal for armored warfare. Vital German industrial centers, direct routes to Hamburg, Bremen, and northern ports. The Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. Eisenhower assigned Montgomery the responsibility for clearing the west bank of the Rhine, preparing the main set-piece crossing in the north, defending against any German counterattack, capturing the Ruhr from the north, advancing toward the Baltic to prevent Soviet occupation. This was a massive responsibility, and Montgomery prepared accordingly. Montgomery's style returns: order, planning, precision. After the chaos of the Ardennes and the political fallout of his press conference, Montgomery returned to the battlefield determined to prove his worth. His headquarters began planning Operation Plunder, the great crossing of the Rhine, with the same methodical care that defined El Alamein: enormous stockpiles of ammunition, hundreds of amphibious vehicles, detailed bridge construction planning rehearsals, of night crossings coordination, with airborne units engineering resources on a scale never seen before, precise timetables. For every unit, Montgomery believed in overwhelming force, not gambling. He would not repeat the mistakes of Market Garden. This time, logistics would be flawless. Intelligence would be thorough, air support would be dominant, deception operations would mislead the Germans. Everything would be prepared. The unexpected twist: the U.S. crosses the Rhine. First, on March 7, 1945, something happened that changed the political atmosphere overnight. U.S. forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, intact. A combination of courage, luck, and German failure allowed American troops of the 9th Armored Division to storm the bridge before it could be demolished. It was the first Allied crossing of the Rhine. The American soldiers suddenly found themselves with a bridgehead on the German side, a foothold in the supposedly impregnable line, a moment of historical triumph. It stunned the German leadership. It electrified the Allied press. It overshadowed Montgomery's careful preparations. Eisenhower recognized the strategic value immediately, but refused to alter the main plan. The Remagen bridgehead would be expanded, but Montgomery's large-scale crossing was still vital. Still, the narrative had shifted. The Americans crossed first. Montgomery felt the pressure, but he stayed focused. Operation Plunder would go ahead. Bigger, stronger, and more decisive. Operation Plunder, 23 to 24 March 1945, Crossing the Rhine Operation. Plunder was one of the largest and most meticulously prepared operations of the entire war. Montgomery commanded a massive army group. The British Second Army, Miles Dempsey. The Canadian First Army, Harry Crerar. The U.S. Ninth Army, William Simpson. Combined, they formed a formidable assault force. The crossing occurred near Wessel, Rees, and Rheinberg, along a broad front carefully chosen to avoid the strongest German defenses. The night before the crossing, the night sky lit up with the glow of 3,000 artillery guns, waves of RAF bombers' flares, illuminating German positions, tracer fire streaking across the river. It was a spectacle reminiscent of the opening barrage at El Alamein, but multiplied in scale. Montgomery's goal was complete suppression. German defenders would be stunned, disoriented, unable to resist effectively. Operation Varsity, the airborne component. Simultaneously, Montgomery launched Operation Varsity, the largest single airborne operation of the war, conducted in one day. It involved the U.S.'s 17th Airborne Division, the British 6th Airborne Division. Their objectives: secure territory east of the Rhine, disrupt German reinforcements, seize key towns and road junctions, support the river crossing. Unlike Market Garden, Varsity took place after the ground assault began, not before. Montgomery had learned from past mistakes. The airborne drop succeeded, though at significant cost, especially to American glider units and the British paras. The crossing itself, a masterclass in execution. At night and under fire, British, Canadian, and American assault boats crossed the Rhine. Engineers worked furiously, building pontoon bridges, establishing ferry points, clearing mines, dragging tanks across the river, repairing damaged crossings under fire infantry, moved with determination across the water. Tanks rumbled over newly built Bailey bridges. Amphibious vehicles churned through the currents. The German resistance was fierce at first, but the scale of Allied preparation overwhelmed them. Entire German battalions surrendered. Others broke and fled. Within 48 hours, Montgomery held a massive bridgehead. It was one of the most flawless operations of the European War. Even his critics admitted that Plunder Varsity demonstrated Montgomery at his absolute best. The advance into northern Germany. With the Rhine crossed, the road into northern Germany lay open. Montgomery pushed forward with speed and coordination toward Bremen, toward Hamburg, toward Lübeck, toward the Baltic Sea. His forces liberated Dutch towns, long under brutal occupation. They helped eject German forces from the western Netherlands. They captured key ports and industrial cities. But the most important objective lay to the south. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, closing the Ruhr pocket. A strategic triumph. The Ruhr was defended by the German Army Group B, General Walter Model, what remained of Germany's industrial workforce. Eisenhower ordered Montgomery and Bradley to encircle the entire region. From the north came Montgomery's XXX Corps. From the south came the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies. The jaws closed slowly, but relentlessly. By mid-April, the Ruhr pocket was sealed. Inside were over 300,000 German soldiers, entire Waffen-SS units, Volkssturm defenders, Factory workers pressed into service. The fighting was intense, especially in the industrial cities, but the outcome was inevitable. Model refused to surrender and ultimately took his own life. His army dissolved. The destruction of the Ruhr was one of the final decisive blows of the European War. Montgomery and the race to the Baltic. With the Ruhr eliminated, Montgomery drove northeast. His goal: reach the Baltic Sea before the Soviet Red Army. A secondary objective was the liberation of Denmark and the protection of northern German territories from Soviet occupation. Montgomery's advance was swift, crossing the Weser, taking Hanover, capturing Hamburg, liberating parts of Schleswig-Holstein. By May 2, 1945, his forces reached Lübeck on the Baltic Sea, sealing off northern Germany. This move prevented Soviet forces from advancing into Denmark and northern ports. It was a geopolitical win, with consequences lasting long after the war. The surrender at Lüneburg Heath, May 4, 1945. On May 4, 1945, German forces in the north formally surrendered to Montgomery. At Lüneburg Heath, German envoys approached Montgomery's headquarters. They offered the capitulation of all German forces in the Netherlands, the capitulation of German forces in Denmark, the capitulation of German forces in northwest Germany. Montgomery arrived in his black beret, calm but firm. The German officers stood rigid, defeated, exhausted. The surrender documents were placed on his table. The moment was captured in photographs. Montgomery seated confidently, the Germans standing behind him in silence. It was one of the most iconic images of the end of the war in Europe. 3 days later, on May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Montgomery's final reputation at war's end. Montgomery ended the war with a legacy filled with victory, controversy, admiration, and frustration. His achievements: victory at El Alamein, the North African pursuit, the liberation of Sicily shared with Patton, leadership in Normandy, critical decisions in the Bulge mastery of the Rhine crossing, the capture of the Ruhr, preventing Soviet expansion into Denmark, receiving the surrender of German forces in the north. It was a resume matched by few generals in history. His flaws: difficult personality, strained relations with American commanders, overconfidence at Market Garden, poor political instincts, tendency to claim excessive credit. Montgomery was both brilliant and infuriating, both indispensable and divisive, both a national hero and a global controversy. Yet, no historian doubts this. Without Montgomery, the Allied victory in Europe would have been significantly harder and perhaps slower. He was one of the central architects of Allied success. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stood among the most famous military leaders in the world. He had commanded vast armies, fought decisive battles, and accepted the surrender of German forces in the north. To many British citizens, he was the man who saved the nation, the calm voice at El Alamein, the architect of Overlord, the general who had shepherded Britain from the darkest hours of 1942 to the triumphs of 1945. Yet peace brought a different kind of war, a war of memory, politics, and public perception. A war Montgomery could neither plan nor control with maps, artillery, or infantry. In the years after the conflict, Monty's legacy became complex. Praised as a hero, criticized as arrogant, admired as a brilliant tactician, dismissed as an impossible colleague. He would never again command great armies, but he would command endless debate among historians. This is the final chapter of his story, the story of a man who won battles, shaped history, and left behind a legacy as rich and contradictory as the war he helped to win. A nation in celebration and exhaustion. After the German surrender, Montgomery returned to London briefly. Streets were filled with cheering crowds, waving flags, and singing. Soldiers home on leave carried newspapers showing photographs of Montgomery at the surrender table in Lüneburg Heath. Children waved banners with his name. But Britain was also exhausted. Cities lay in ruins. Families were grieving. Rationing continued. The future was uncertain. Montgomery quickly realized that victory was only one part of the story. The reconstruction, both physical and emotional, would take years. Yet Monty was not a domestic politician. He was a soldier without a battlefield. And for the first time in years, he found himself without a clear mission, occupation duty, and the transition to peace. In the months following the German surrender, Montgomery became commander-in-chief of the British occupation forces in Germany. His responsibility was immense, ensuring law and order, supervising the disarmament of German forces, overseeing demilitarization and denazification, rebuilding civil structures, managing millions of displaced civilians, preventing famine and disease. Montgomery approached the task with the same discipline he brought to military operations. He insisted on clear rules, strong administration, and strict accountability. He was firm with former Nazi officials, but compassionate toward civilians, especially children and families who had lost everything. German citizens remembered him as strict but fair, orderly, but not cruel, distant but not hostile. In one interview, a German teacher said, "We respected Montgomery because he respected himself. He behaved like a soldier, not a conqueror." Cold War role: Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO. In 1948, Montgomery was appointed chairman of the Western European Union Defense Organization, and later he became Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe under NATO. His job was to help organize European defense against a new threat, the Soviet Union. Monty believed strongly in unified command, standardized military training, strong discipline, modernization of equipment, constant readiness. He traveled widely, giving speeches, meeting generals, inspecting units. But many younger leaders in NATO found him old-fashioned. He dismissed nuclear weapons as not real soldiering. He criticized American strategies too bluntly. He struggled to adapt to Cold War politics. He clashed with diplomats and administrators. Montgomery was always a man of the battlefield. He excelled in war, but diplomacy tested his patience, and politics frustrated him. In 1958, he retired from NATO service. Retirement, memoirs, controversy, and reflection. Retirement did not silence Montgomery. In fact, it gave him a new voice through books, speeches, and radio appearances. Montgomery's memoirs. In 1958, he published The Memoirs of Field Marshal Montgomery. It became a bestseller but created an uproar in military circles. Montgomery openly criticized Eisenhower's leadership, American battlefield decisions, the broad front strategy, British political leaders, even his fellow British generals. Some saw the book as honest. Others saw it as self-centered and disrespectful. General Eisenhower, normally diplomatic, told close associates, "Monty has done himself a great disservice." Patton, who had died before the book appeared, would have said worse. Montgomery's memoirs cemented his pattern. Brilliant on analysis, poor on diplomacy, exceptional on detail, blind to political consequences. Public life. A national figure, a public speaker, a teacher. Despite controversies, Montgomery remained a national icon. He visited schools and cadet programs, gave lectures on leadership and morale, advocated for strong physical training and discipline, encouraged young officers to study history, met with veterans and grieving families. He was direct, sharp, and sometimes harsh, but audiences respected him. Older citizens, especially those who lived through the war, adored him. For them, Montgomery represented stability in chaos, calm under pressure, pride in victory, memories of hardship and triumph. He became something like a living symbol of Britain's wartime spirit. Montgomery's personality, strengths and flaws. To understand Montgomery's legacy, one must understand his character, a mixture of brilliance and difficulty that shaped every aspect of his career. Strengths. Absolute clarity. He made complex plans simple and understandable. morale building. His troops trusted him deeply. Iron discipline. He valued training, order, and preparation. Calm leadership. He never panicked, never rushed into disaster. Operational skill. He understood logistics and battlefield tempo better than most commanders. Flaws, ego, and pride. He needed recognition and often claimed too much credit. Poor diplomacy. He clashed with American generals and sometimes even British ones. Inflexibility. He preferred methodical operations and disliked improvisation. Lack of political awareness. He underestimated the importance of coalition politics. Montgomery was a soldier, not a politician, and he never pretended otherwise. Historical debates. How should Montgomery be judged? Among historians, Montgomery remains one of the most debated figures of the Second World War. The case for Montgomery. He delivered Britain's first major land victory at El Alamein. He rebuilt the Eighth Army when morale was near collapse. He played a central role in Overlord, shaping the ground plan. His strategy in Normandy worked, even if slowly. He stabilized the front during the Battle of the Bulge when panic threatened disaster. He executed the Rhine crossing flawlessly. His personal presence inspired millions during Britain's darkest hours. The case against Montgomery Market Garden was a serious miscalculation, driven partly by ego. He was difficult to work with, damaging Allied unity. He underestimated his critics and mishandled public relations. He often exaggerated his own role, especially in the Bulge. He dismissed American contributions too bluntly, creating resentment. These debates continue today and will continue for decades. Montgomery's final years. Quiet reflection. In the 1960s and 1970s, Montgomery lived a quieter life in his country home in Hampshire. He gardened, wrote, met friends, and occasionally traveled. He maintained correspondence with soldiers from his old units and enjoyed talking to young cadets. Yet, he also lived with regrets. The death of soldiers under his command, the bitterness after his press conference, the strain in relations with American commanders, the tragedy of Market Garden, the loss of wartime comrades. But he also held pride, not arrogance, but pride in service. He often said, "I did my best. That is all any man can do." Death and national mourning. Bernard Montgomery died on March 24, 1976, at age 88. Britain mourned him deeply. Veterans came to salute. Flags flew at half-mast. Newspapers published tributes. The Queen sent condolences. Tens of thousands lined the streets. He was buried at Holy Cross Church in Binstead, Hampshire, a quiet English setting far from the deserts of Egypt and the fields of Normandy, where he had shaped history. His grave is modest, a simple stone for a man whose life was anything but simple. Montgomery's legacy, a lasting impact. Today, historians agree on several truths about Montgomery. 1. He was one of the most influential Allied generals of the war. Without him, the North African campaign might have ended disastrously. 2. He restored British morale at a moment of deep crisis. His leadership at El Alamein changed the course of the war. 3. He was a master of preparation. His careful planning saved thousands of lives. 4. He clashed with his allies, but contributed more than he damaged. Even critics admit he was essential to victory. 5. His faults were human, and his strengths were exceptional. He was not perfect, he was not always likable, but he was effective. 6. His legend outlived him. Books, documentaries, museums, war colleges, all still debate him. For veterans and civilians who lived through the war, Montgomery symbolized resolve, determination, and the belief that discipline and careful thought could overcome even the greatest danger. He remains one of Britain's most iconic military figures, a man whose flaws only make his achievements more remarkable.